All right. Well, it is officially 11:03, and that is our official start time, 3 minutes after. Gives people enough time to collect themselves and get from the last meeting to this one, and 11:03 is our official time. So let us roll and not get behind. All righty, I got to do my screen sharing part here. Okay. Can you all see the welcome sign? Good. Okay. Well, so what it says, welcome. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those in other parts of the world even. It's 11:03 here on the west coast of the US, and I'm very glad to see everybody here today. Thanks for being here. I am Leila Nattagh, and I'm your host today. The webinar today is being recorded, and it will be made available online later. All of ours are stacked up on YouTube and available there, so you can catch them if you haven't seen the others. And we are actually getting quite a good, what do you call it, a readership or a watchership on those. So those will be there for perpetuity. At Recapture It, we are passionate stewards of salvage, extending the life of building materials and buildings with three things. We've got the solution to construction waste, which is underway. We have the place to shop for and sell treasures of recaptured building materials at recaptureit.com. And like for today's topic, we have help for cities to craft clear and effective reuse policy, which is the broad scope of today's discussion and part of the DPA, which is our deconstruction policy accelerator. Yeah, we as a company, we're entering into the world of planning and policy with cities and counties across the US. This webinar is the third in an ongoing series of webinars, workshops, and all-day-long boot camps provided to educate, inform, and even inspire officials, sustainability champions to understand the need to move toward deconstruction from the total demolition and disposal of buildings. We all know how bad that is. Each event builds on the others, and the workshops and boot camps get into much greater detail than the webinars. But this webinar will be a practical introductory conversation with two exceptional, outstanding experts. I'm so glad are here. It'll be about some of the many benefits of the single solution for eliminating the largest waste-producing practices in the world, construction and demolition waste. And what is that solution? Deconstruction. Deconstruction of dead buildings, deconstruction of building modifications, carefully dismantling them rather than just blowing them up and breaking them and throwing them away. So, this month's topic, what is the treasure in trash for your city? So that speaks to the benefits, the pluses of deconstruction. As I said, I'm your host, founder and the CEO of Recapture It, and the creator of the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator, the DPA. My background's in architecture and construction, remodeling. I built our own house. I was in facilities management, taking care of other people's nice, big, beautiful buildings for about 11 years. And this is my 7th business started from scratch. I am a perpetual scrounger of materials and a fighter against waste, and have been, and luckily or fortunately get to incorporate that into what I do now. So on to the good part. Our panelists today. We have two very energetic experts with us today, Jessica Marschall and Leila Nattagh, and they are going to share their experiences with you. And at the end, answer some questions if you have them. You can put those questions into the chat here. So just find the little chat bubble and type to your heart's content. So Jessica Marschall is a licensed CPA and has Marschall Accounting Services. She's also the owner of an art and appraisal, antiques appraisal service called Probity Appraisal Group, and is also the founder of The Green Mission, specializing in waste diversion efforts, qualified non-monetary donation appraisals, and deconstruction management. You think she's busy? Yeah. Jessica has provided us with financial services for our company and is our financial advisor, and she is hugely devoted to the prosperity of deconstruction and reuse in the built environment, the buildings we live in, that we work in. So our other delightful guest today is Leila Nattagh, and she is the founder and owner of WTR Solutions. WTR stands for Waste to Resources. That's their focus, making sure that resources are not wasted. She's a scientist and an entrepreneur, and WTR says today's customers demand environmental responsibility. We help you quantify your impact so you can share your story. That sums it up. She and her team help you to put numbers and facts, sort of the dry stuff, into your story in plain language that lets others understand and absorb their impact. So we are very glad to have these two amazing women with us today and to share their knowledge and energy. And like always, remember this, I'll shake my finger. Waste is not waste until it's wasted. Okay, let's find the right button here to stop share. There we go. Okay, now we just get to see one another. All righty. Let's get started with some questions of our guests today. Jessica, let's start with you. One of the key ingredients in the whole process of moving these mammoth amounts of building materials from staying on their merry path to the dump is that donating building materials can be a substantial tax write-off, right? So, can you please tell our audience how this works and what it can mean for an average deconstruction project?
So, for better or worse, the IRS has provided us with the carrot to potentially move from a demolition to a deconstruction because of the tax deduction that's available. So I will try not to get too professorial here, but an individual or a pass-through entity can take itemized deductions, which is the Schedule A. That's where you have medical expenses, that's mortgage interest, state and local taxes. Just like a cash charitable contribution or a non-cash contribution of a piece of art, the same part of the tax form allows for a contribution of building materials, furniture, fixtures, appliances as a non-cash contribution. There's a number of things to remember here when we're talking about the tax deduction. Number one, it is entirely dependent upon the individual, their personal tax return. Corporations can donate as well on their 1120. For individuals, if there is a client in Boston who has a big teardown, $100,000 worth of materials, their federal tax rate and their state tax rate combined may be 45%. Then we move inland to Iowa, and we had a very similar deconstruction there, $100,000 worth of materials, some antique lumber from a barn, just gorgeous materials. His tax rate, 15%. So the client in Boston, every dollar that they're donating through the deduction is worth 45 cents back in the net after tax effect. In Iowa, it was 15%. That 15% was not enough of a motivation for that donor to procure a deconstruction company, which of course costs more and takes longer because you're taking apart carefully. I won't go down there. We'll let Dave Bennick and all the experts say how that's done. From the tax perspective, though, as long as the IRS is tethering this to the Schedule A or the 1120, you are capped at that effective tax rate. So unfortunately, what we see is that with the increase in the effective tax rate, all of a sudden people's appetite for being sustainable and being environmental just explodes the higher their tax rate. What I would prefer, if the IRS would ever call me up and ask my advice on rewriting the IRC, would be an equitable tax credit, because the tax credit could be used whether or not someone itemizes, and it would not be dependent on the effective tax rate. Make it one better, have it refundable. So you could bring people from middle to lower income into deconstruction. Because remember, if you do not itemize to start with, and under our current tax law, the TCJA, the standard deduction is so high, some people don't even make it to the itemized deduction cap before the non-cash kicks in. So I hate the way it's written. What it means is that people who tend to have more are giving more of the building materials, and people with no tax deduction, they generally don't, unless they just are either there's a deconstruction ordinance that uses the stick that's very effective if we get those ordinances in place to work with the tax deduction, because we cannot rely on this tax deduction alone. Another problem with the tax deduction, you can only donate to a nonprofit or a governmental organization. So nonprofits, some of them are fantastic. They have an excellent chain of sale and marketplace. Many are not. I had a colleague in Wisconsin who had Kohler dump about 500 beautiful soaking tubs and wall-mounted vessel sinks in inner city Milwaukee. The population in inner city Milwaukee who are looking for first-time homes are not looking for soaking tubs. So there's a lot to work on here. Those are the general parameters of how the tax deduction works, why it is so important, why the appraisal needs to be done. But those are some of the issues that I see with it in practice.
Wow. That's a lot to know. Wow.
You can just mute me at some point when
Yeah. No,
I just won't stop talking.
That is a lot to know. And I just learned a couple of things myself. So thank you. Wow. Okay. Leila, you work with all kinds of companies and you're quantifying their carbon footprints and their greenhouse gas emissions. You put this information into accessible, highly understandable language to help your clients not only know what this stuff means, but so they can communicate it easily to others, right? So how do you see this helping advance reuse through deconstruction? What role can this serve in how buildings get reused?
Yeah, like you said, I think it's really just about simplifying that language so it's easy to understand for everybody. And so sustainability can, again, be simplified down to the concepts that we're really all familiar with. For example, the 3 R's, the reduce, reuse, and then recycle of the waste hierarchy. And if anyone is familiar with circular economy, this is really the backbone of circular economy. This is what that butterfly diagram is all about. It's just about keeping those goods in use for as long as possible. And prioritizing certain actions over others. So recycle is really like the last thing that we do. So your question of how we can advance reuse through deconstruction really just goes back to this simplification. Like sustainability doesn't have to be a mystery, it doesn't have to be a super complex kind of concept that seems out of reach for many of us. It can really be more approachable and accessible than that. So it doesn't have to be a black box is what I'm trying to say. But I think the missing piece that is needed in order to advance deconstruction, reuse through deconstruction is to have more of that education piece incorporated in it. So what we don't typically talk about is the environmental impact of new construction. Like that doesn't really hit our news that much. We talk about plastics, we talk about microplastics, but like where are we talking about the impact of new construction and how polluting that actually is? We don't talk about it that much. So according to some of my research, if concrete itself were a nation, it would be the 3rd highest polluting country in the world, just because it's so damaging, just because we have to heat up the concrete at high temperatures to make or cement and so forth. And that really is the backbone of every building that we make. We don't actually talk about that. So of course it is an extreme example, but really we're just saying that this is an example of a material which has really high footprint. And the fact remains that for any new material, its environmental footprint, its impact is going to be much higher than if we were to deconstruct it, move it, and reuse it elsewhere. That's just always going to be the case.
Mm-hmm. And Leila, there's sort of a salesy, or well, that's not the right word, a persuasive argument that can be made with actual facts, scientific data that says this is better because of that, right? And that's part of this, what your kind of work can bring to that, bring to reuse, is that that scientific backing, so that there's a backboard against which all of the less factual things, the feel good things, the sometimes hyperboles can state. But you know, when you just say, well, you know what, it's actually going to be 14 times better if we do this. wait, what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the missing piece where we assume that things are better, but like how much better is it? So you have a material made with recycled content. Okay, we assume it's better, but like how much better is it?
Yep.
So yeah, my job is really quantifying that piece and making sure that we report actual numbers so that we also do stay away from greenwashing, because sometimes we think it's better, but it's actually not. But in this case, reuse is always going to be better than the new material. But really, it's just about, having accurate information so we can back up our claims with accurate information.
Exactly. Thanks. That's exactly what I was getting at. So, back to Ms. Marschall. So, Jessica, you told me a story not too long ago about a tax write-off that was almost missed because the client neglected to see the value or just sort of didn't understand the value, even though you gave a valuation appraisal. And the owners almost decided to have their building demolished instead of deconstructed. Can you tell us what happened with that and some of the more interesting details of that?
Yes. So as appraisers, we try to get to the decision maker as quickly as possible. And as a background to that, we're usually called in at the last minute. The wrecking ball is coming the next morning. Oh, we heard something about deconstruction. Are there any tax benefits? So we get in there and we're able to, our COO has a construction management degree. So he's able to look and determine what can be harvested and what can be salvaged and donated. And we assign a value to that, a preliminary value, so they have a ballpark. Let's say that it's a full decon, $100,000. So we sent this quote to the client. He did not send it to his CPA, which is always key. Send it to your CPA. When in doubt, tell your CPA. Anything happens. And the CPA happened to see this the day before the demo and said, "Are you kidding me? You're already itemizing." They were in New York City. They were well over the 50% tax rate because they were hit with the net investment tax. A lot of surtaxes there, plus the 10+% in Manhattan. So because they came to us, and it was a lot more than $100,000, it was in the millions, and it was a gorgeous property that was in a historic area of New York City, where there was a nonprofit that was ready to preserve these elements and reuse them in new construction right down the street in this borough. So the CPA happened to look at this, and it was about a $3.5 million potential write-off, and said, they talked to me, and that's always critical because we need to speak our tax language. They need to check my qualifications, making sure I'm a qualified appraiser, making sure I'm tethering these values to actual sales on the open market, that I'm not, we don't do appraisals and say, aha, that building is worth 3.5 million. No, that was crammed with about 6 pages of spreadsheets. And then the data for that appraisal, when we were done, it was about 2,000 pages, because the IRS will let you take these deductions, but you sure as heck better make sure they're documented and backed up. So within 2 hours, it came down to the line. And demolition crews, we're getting a lot more in the Northeast that work interchangeably with deconstruction and are willing to slow things down, but a lot of them aren't. They're booked out for months ahead. It's demo and done, and they have more demand than they can even supply. So they get very upset when the appraiser comes in and says, but wait, these gorgeous columns that are circa 1786, and we have some part pine lumber that was actually transported from Alabama up to New York City in the late 1700s, which I don't even know what mechanisms were there to bring it, but this was such a historic structure that they were ready to trash. And these were beams that the linear feet, just they're not made like that anymore. It was gorgeous. We were able to salvage it all. The nonprofit is an amazing organization up in New York that deals with high-end antique, was able to get it back for reuse within a year. A lot of the things that he sold just flew off of his marketplace site. But it was the difference with checking with a CPA to see if you can take that tax deduction. And of course, the client, what they're remembering, what they're thanking us for is $3.5 million. You can do the math there. If that's at 50% effective tax rate, that's a huge write-off.
Wow.
And for individuals and corporations, it's based on it carries forward for 5 years after 50% of your adjusted gross income, 10% of corporate net income. So even if they hit that 50% of adjusted gross income limit, they have 5 more years. Another important thing to remind your clients is that the Tax Cuts and Job Act sunsets in 2025. At that time, we revert to the prior tax code, which means that tax rates will go higher and brackets will be narrower. So by definition, these donations in the year 2025, short of who knows I won't even get into Congress and what goes on there, but that's what is law right now. So these donations are worth a lot more in 2025. We really need to speak to the client and get their CPA involved and let them understand what is a qualified appraisal and an appraiser, what is not, because you will see there's tax court precedent. If you don't use a qualified appraiser, if you don't fill out Form 82, 83 to the box, it comes under DEFRA under the IRS. It is absolute disallowance if you miss a box. That is how strict compliance this is with the IRS. So that underlying appraisal, that's why we spend so long, because this is going under scrutiny to the IRS to substantiate a significant tax deduction. And as a CPA of 22 years, tax deductions like this do not come along. When you look at the EV vehicle and what the income limits are for that and the credit, this is a huge deduction. It's why we have the charitable museum structure that we have where people donate to charity. The IRS isn't looking to disallow this anytime soon, but if it is, if people do not do this correctly and follow what the IRS says and use the appropriate appraisers, it could go the way of the cars and boats, which means that you can only deduct the price that they actually sell it, and you'd get a clawback. So that is something that's kind of outside the bounds of this. But the important thing to remember is that the tax deduction is there, it's significant, and right now it's one of the best carrots that we have in our arsenal to move the needle away from demolition and towards deconstruction.
Wow. Well, that was a substantial one, and I remember that kind of gasping when you told me that story. And wow, there is great complexity in the IRS, and it's good to have people like you who know what the heck is going on with all that, because wow. Yeah, you are a font of knowledge on that there, Jessica. Wow. Okay, Leila, this is sort of a two-parter here. Do you have a best case, a real life example of a company that you worked with who made the modifications of their operations based on your recommendations, and what kind of an actual difference that made? And then part two of the question, and you and I spoke about this a little bit not too long ago. Could you apply this similar sort of analysis and recommendation to a whole city or a region to estimate the impact a specific set of changes could make over, say, a 10-year period of time? So that's looking at it from the company level, and at the city level, what are the changes that you can see that a company can or has done, and what could a city do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Sure.
I think the most recent real life example that I can think of where they made changes to their operations was a marketing / branding company that I work with. So they do some digital marketing, and they design websites, etc. But then they also have a merchandising arm where they design products for their customers. So this could be anything from like mugs to hoodies to, I don't know, blankets, etc. And so when we measured their overall emissions for their entire company, we found that a lot of their emissions come from the materials that they purchase to customize for their customers, which makes sense. And that part, there's only so much they could do to actually reduce the emissions unless they kind of stop that piece of their business, which they're not going to do. But what we found was that about 15% of their overall emissions was coming from the transportation of these materials, the mugs, the hoodies, hats, whatever, from China to their facility in Utah. So, and the reason being is that a lot of them were being transported by airplane from China all the way to the US, which, as you might imagine, has a huge footprint. So we realized that if they were to switch the transportation mode to, let's say, boat, this would be a huge reduction in terms of their carbon emissions for that transportation piece. And so when we actually did the calculations, we realized that per shipment, and we just estimated a shipment of about 1,000 kilograms per shipment, it would save them 84%. It would be 84% less carbon emissions per shipment, which is huge. Yeah, and so of course, not all of their shipments can be switched over to coming over by boat just because the customer wanted it like yesterday, so they're on a rush. They can't wait an extra 3 to 4 weeks to get it. But if they were to switch about 40% of their shipments to boat, I think they would save about 99 tons a year of CO2. And there would be also huge financial savings. I forget what the numbers were, but there was like thousands and thousands of dollars a year that they would be saving. Of course, I didn't like focus that much on that, but they really cared about the money savings, which makes sense. But I was focused on the CO2 savings. So it was kind of just a win-win for both of them.
Yeah.
And so to answer your second question of how do we translate that work for companies to cities, it's similar. So really the process of measuring emissions is really about breaking down the emissions to scope 1, 2, and 3. And really, if we want to talk about it in simple terms, it's about defining which emissions are direct and which ones are indirect. So in a city, the main emission sources are your stationary combustion, which is coming from your buildings. It's transportation, so how people get around, how people get around basically. Waste, industrial processes, or if there's any kind of manufacturing, whatever kind of industry is present in that city, and of course like agricultural, forestry, etc., and anything that is happening outside of the geographic area because of the city's activities. So at a very basic level, if the city knows how much of their waste is actually reusable construction material and have a plan to divert a percentage of it, we can then apply some assumptions and extrapolate what those emission savings are going to be, say, over a 5-year or 10-year period. And this estimate is going to need some kind of inputs. We're going to look at different factors, such as what is their current waste management practices? Are they putting it in an incinerator? Is it going to landfill? Like, we need to look at these different parameters, and also what is their current growth rate? But really, it's just a matter of considering all these different assumptions and extrapolating it out. But again, going back to what I just mentioned in your last question, was that whatever you reuse is going to have a less environmental impact than what you make brand new, even though you're going to have to deconstruct it, even though you move it maybe across the city, across the country, it's still going to be less impact than making something brand new.
Right, right. Do you have any little sort of tasty tidbits of an example of something in a comparative sense used to new carbon footprint differential?
Well, the one that I could think of right now, is that right? We're just back from maternity leave, so my brain is a little foggy, to be
Sorry,
honest.
I gotcha. Sorry.
But I had an old client get back to me and said, okay, we make this fleece sweater. It's about like an 80-20 mix, 20% recycled material, and now we're moving it to 30% recycled material. And I think I remember from their initial assessment, it was like each 1% would be about it was about like 10% reduction. So anyways, it was almost like a linear 1-to-1 ratio of, if you have more recycled content, your emissions are going to come down linearly. So it's just kind of like a no-brainer. Like, they were wondering if they should even incorporate more recycled content. And after a quick comparison, we said, yeah, you're never going to lose incorporating more recycled content for that specific product. It's usually going to be the case, but we need to look at it to confirm that number, but it's pretty much always going to be that.
Yep. I like those. Those are handy to have. You know, the one I use is that a university in Wisconsin did a study, and they compared used 2x4s to new 2x4s and their carbon footprint. And the new one, made from the virgin raw material had a 13x carbon footprint to the used. So there's room to do things with that.
Just a little.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, back to Jessica in Rome. So, Jessica, what do you see as the biggest hindrance to making this tax write-off advantage of deconstruction and reuse more known to Americans? How might that be made better, more known, more accessible, more,
Yeah. The key is, from my perspective, this is a shock, is the CPAs. CPAs and tax attorneys need to know about this because they have to be able to understand the underlying value of this material. All of you probably know this, that the value of antique lumber right now, and with the supply side issues of COVID, and then we have inflation. So we see for antique lumber, for example, a very inelastic price. It's going to stay relatively high, for the foreseeable future. So there are some clients, especially in the middle of the country, who have these gorgeous barns that are 100, 150 years old, and it's worth a lot, as is the dimensions of the lumber and the hand hewn versus the current lumber techniques. So it's very valuable. So the best way that we can get this information to the decision maker, which is the taxpayer, is we've got their CPAs they need to know about, the taxpayer themselves. So the building industry, people need to understand, and we need to work with contractors who can tell their clients about this. So there's also an issue, I'll throw a little bit more tax here, but the owner has to actually have owned the materials to accomplish the long-term capital gain holding period of 1 year. So you have to have owned the materials and the property for 1 year in order to be able to take the non-cash charitable contribution. But when we work with builders, we get a lot of referrals from them because they will have a client who, let's say they purchased a homestead 2 years ago. They decide that they're going to tear it all down. We see a lot of this in the Northeast. It's so sad. We'll see a gorgeous house that was purchased on Cape Cod. They purchase it for $4 million. They decide to renovate it and they decide everything must go. So we have sub-zero double column refrigerators that are 5 years old, that have barely been used, that are ready to go to the dumpster. We see gorgeous, and we've got the great friends over at Eco Building Bargains in Boston ready to jump in and take this material. Ann and Liz with Waste Not. So we're ready for it, but getting to those decision makers and letting them know, we understand you bought a $4 million home, you're tearing down to rebuild a $12 million. That's fine. But when you tear down that $4 million home, let's say that there's 20 grand of appliances and cabinetry, just a kitchen renovation in one of these high-end homes. That's a tax benefit. We have to get them to see that from my side, which is the carrot, here is what we can offer you as a tax deduction. Let's get to the decision makers, be it builders, contractors, CPAs, taxpayers. The more that all of us do in this holistic deconstruction and sustainable building environment, the more we talk about this with the CODA, and there's a tax deduction in it for you. And, again, like I said, I see the most hardened people who do not care about deconstruction become environmental, stalwart supporters when they find out that they're going to save 40 grand on their taxes. So, so it's a carrot. As I said in the introduction, it has its shortfalls. It's like I mentioned, there's a lot of things that this could be done better. We've got to make sure that these appraisals are sound. They have to be to tethered asset sales, the same way that we value art, the same way that we value a business. We're looking at comparable sales in the open market, not pie in the sky. You've got to be qualified, and these appraisals take a heck of a lot of long time to do, and a lot of hard work.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. That's a good answer, but wow. All right. Work to be done there, huh? All righty, Leila.
Put it on all of your to-do list, nothing major.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Just, yeah. Nothing major. Okay, Leila, similar to the question I just asked Jessica, the scientific and statistical nature of the work you do can be daunting and almost gibberish to many people. I mean, sequestered carbon. I mean, I like that one, but what's the difference between sequestered carbon and embodied carbon? What are anthropogenic emissions? What is radiative forcing and net zero emissions? I mean, it gets kind of complicated. So can we communicate these complex subjects to a wider audience in ways that we can all better understand the consequences of actions, good and bad, in ways that people, and this is very important, that they can feel emotionally rather than analytically, because people act on emotions. So is there a way to, have you thought about that and what you do to convey that emotional sense of this stuff to them?
Such a good question. And I feel like haven't quite mastered the emotional piece, but I hope I'm getting better. So this reminds me of an incident that just happened. So I've just moved to Columbus, Ohio. I'm in the process of making new friends, which is actually difficult when you are an adult and you work from home. Anyway, so I met a group of people and I told them what I do. I help businesses measure their carbon emissions. And one of them that I kind of hit it off with, she looked at me, she's like, I don't know what that means. And I was so appreciative of her honesty, because I tend to live in my head. I'm used to all this jargon, and I don't realize that it's meaningless to most people. So I'm glad that she's like, what are you talking about? Like, that means nothing to me. So I was glad for that. So to go back to your question of like, how do we actually communicate effectively? I think it's a matter of, of course, simplifying the language and then using different tools and having those tools in our back pocket so we can do this like second nature. So I like the tool of just storytelling, and it can be so simple. Like, we hear storytelling, but like it can really be simple as like, we have a problem, climate change is here, and extreme weather conditions, or whatever you want to kind of attach to that. So it becomes more personal. And then the solution is, or one of the solutions is, reuse materials and deconstruction, etc. And having some kind of hero in that story, which can be cities, who can create policies so we actually can reuse and divert materials to be reused. And there you go. We have a story. Climate change as a problem, deconstruction is a solution, and cities can be the heroes by advancing this forward through better policies. Bam. So I like the idea of using stories to move people and to create that emotional connection, like you mentioned. Visuals are powerful, and my go-to when I talk to my clients and help them communicate their findings to their customers. And I think the last piece is just having some kind of analogy that is, again, easy to understand. Like, you brought up sequestered carbon, and many are like, I don't know what that means. Like, what does that mean? And so my perfect analogy for that, in terms of, sequestered carbon, is if we think of a bathtub that's overflowing with water, the water's on, the water's overflowing. We can think of the bathtub as our dear planet Earth, and the water is all the carbon, all the greenhouse gases that's in the atmosphere. So it's too much, it's overflowing. And so in this scenario, if we want to prevent ourselves from drowning, please, can we do this? We need to turn off the faucet. So we need to limit our greenhouse gases. But at the same time, the water is still going to be full in that bathtub. So we need to actually drain the tub. So that's where sequestered carbon comes in. So sequestering means like withdraw or draw down, or like, absorb from the atmosphere. So, the tub is not so full. So that's what sequestered carbon can mean. And so anyways, I guess the point is use analogies to better convey these complex ideas, and just having these kind of tools in our back pocket to say, okay, if I were to really explain this in layman terms, like, how would I do this? How do I explain this? And just try to talk to people outside of your usual network who can give you that reality check of, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you just say it in simpler terms?
Yeah, that's good. That's good about the sequestered carbon thing. Yeah. We've talked about trees as being a great sequesterer of carbon, in that, they grow from a little seed or an acorn or a pine nut and into these massive big blocks of carbon, basically. And if they are allowed to stay like that, then they hold it or sequester it for a long, long time. And if they are used in one use and then they get a second life and possibly even a third life, that sequestered state gets to have a continuity, a sustainability, if you will, which is great. So rather than if sometimes in the recycling process of wood, they grind it up and burn it. Okay, well, that gets the energy and that does a good thing. But that burning process then releases that and the sequestration is no longer there. So, yeah.
I forgot to say, how do we actually sequester it? Mostly trees. But there's also new technology that's coming out that can kind of do the work of trees, but hopefully faster, although it has, we're working on scaling those technologies.
Yep. We are. So we're getting some good conversations going on over in the chat. So thanks for those who are commenting and asking questions, and thanks for those who are answering them too. So that's a beautiful thing. Everybody will get the chat in a message back from me. You'll get the whole chat, and you'll get the link to the to this recording. So if you think you're going to miss them, you're not, because we send them to you. Let's see, where are we at here? Oh, Jessica, we're back to you. The whole purpose of making reuse the norm is very important to you. What things outside of the purely financial aspects move you to do what you do? What have you seen that has inspired you?
So, Stephanie and Carol, I have been reading your comments and you have hit the nail on the head. That's exactly, so looping back to when I started all of this about 5 years ago. One of the first people that I met in the industry was Larry. We met, we were fresh out of the gate. His presentation inspired me so to the degree where I just dove in, because what I would love to see someday is being able to capture the volume of materials to provide the materials for an entirely new structure in one spot, essentially like a Home Depot, where even taking that further, if we could get to the point where the Home Depot has half of their stores reclaimed, but we have to get this marketplace moving. We do not have a marketplace that can move in the quantities that we need. We do not have the zoning and the coding. When I speak with contractors, I believe it was Carol who brought up, or was it Stephanie, about contractors and if it's not up to code. And Carol, if it's not up to code, how can they have these doors in? And some of the lumber, even though I've read, and again, not a scientist, just an accountant, but when I read the studies on the hardness of the antique lumber, from my novice brain, it sounds like it's even harder. And Larry shared a study with me once. It is sufficient for new building. But until we can get this marketplace moving and force an entire paradigm shift to what Leila was talking about, how used is always better than new for everything. So in my family, we have 5 children, and we have taken this to heart in all parts of our family. Our furniture is all reused. We go to the thrift stores and we just dive in. That's where we find everything. We need new plates. Okay, let's go over and see what Goodwill has. Let's find these hole in the wall places. And people come into our home. I'm not a great decorator. Again, I'm just a CPA, but people will say, oh my goodness, look at that. $20, found it, on somebody's curb. They didn't need that. They didn't want that table. We have to shift the paradigm, and then we have to make it accessible so people don't have to go out to these nonprofits and say, okay, you've got the 2x4s that I need. I need support pillars. Where can I find those? Oh, there's a nonprofit that's 4 hours away. Let me go send a truck there. It's not feasible until we get the volume of these materials moving. And again, the nonprofit route is fine. I know we're dealing with that right now for the tax deduction. But again, IRS, if you're listening, if you allowed those donations to be made to anybody who is furthering the carbon sequestration and the deconstruction and reuse community, imagine what that would open up. The nonprofits would probably be happy for the help in taking some of these materials, because honestly, sometimes they can't take everything that's donated, and it leaves donors with, okay, who can take this? So our supply side, our supply chain for these materials is way, way off. But I met Larry 5 years ago. I plan on retiring at about age 95. So that's, I'm 47. You can do the math there. When I retire, And on my deathbed, after I file the last tax return and make sure it was accepted, I am hoping that at the same time I could go to recapture it and find 50 of Larry's competitors, and they're all fully stocked with everything you need for building. One spot, check the cart, you're done. Then it's solved. Then I'll die and I'll be happy. And that's the end.
Well, thank you, by the way. That I really didn't actually know that whole story. So that's quite heartwarming. Thank you. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, we built Recapture to be able to do those, to buy from, for an individual buyer to buy from places, you know, one is in Kansas, one's in Iowa, one's in Chicago, and one's in North Oklahoma, and all on one transaction because of that reason, because it's so hard to, I'm going to have to drive 3 hours over to get, you know, those things. And then I'm going to have to go over here to get those things. And the designers and architects I talk to, they're like, nah, clients won't pay me for that. Sorry. I'm like, okay, well, that's another good reason to get this thing going. So, thank you. That was a very emotional tale. Thank you, Jessica. Leila, the question was a good one, if I do say so myself. Would you please answer a very similar one? The whole purpose of quantifying the impact of human behaviors, the built environment and processes is so important to you. What things outside of the purely scientific aspects move you to do what you do? And what have you seen that has inspired you?
Yeah, really good question. I think, yeah, let me answer your last question first. I get a lot of my inspiration from startups that I work with. So I work as a coach, I guess you could say, where I help startups to assess the carbon footprint of their idea. So they have an idea for whatever it may be, and then we at a high level, we go through their numbers to figure out what their impact is going to look like for the first year, et cetera, and going on to their 10th year. And just the ideas they have, there's some of them are just so out there, so interesting and fascinating that I think, oh my gosh, like we just need like 50 more of you and we'll be good. Like this whole climate issue is going to go away. So I get a lot of inspiration from them. And I mean, outside of the whole scientific piece, I get a lot of inspiration or motivation also just from my family. So my nephew, my oldest nephew, live downtown. My oldest nephew is 4 years old. And I just remember when he was born, I was thinking like, what kind of world is he going to live in? Like, what is that going to look like? And then my second nephew was born 2 years later. And it's like, oh, gee, like, what am I doing for these nephews of mine? And then this year I had a baby girl, and of course, the same ideas, but at the same time, I was thinking like, okay, I want to actually be an inspiration for her. I want to be the best version of myself for her. And at the same time, like, I want to be able to like look her in the eye in 20 years when she's like, Mom, what did you do for climate change? Like, I want to say that I did my part.
Yep.
Yeah. And I feel like there's just so many issues going on like right now in the world, whether it's poverty, gender equality, war, you know, gun violence, or government institutions, and like the integrity of our government. And I feel like I'm a bystander for so many of these different issues. And, you know, I would like to take action, but realistically, I'm not like, I'll vote for the right official when the time comes, but that's really all I'm doing. But climate change is like one thing that like, I know it, and I have experience in it, and I know that I can do more. So I feel like that's the one area that I can do something, so I'm not a bystander. And I guess that's where my inspiration comes from. For everything else, I just hope there's someone out there who's smarter than me, who is actually doing something way more than me. But for climate change, I hope to be that person.
Well, that does. And here's what I know about you. You are constantly learning. You're constantly growing. So your future self will be more than you are now. So in that sense,
hope so.
Yeah, no, in that sense, you will be more influential, more impactful as you continue on your journey. So just keep it up. You're doing good.
Thanks. With help with people like you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All righty. So let's go. It's time for Q&A. Look at that. It came right just like that. The chat channel has been busy. And let's see. Thank you again for all of you answering all the chats and doing all that, because that's actually very helpful. So I'm going to pull that over here so I can see what's in there and catch up a bit here. If you, Jessica, or you, Leila, have seen one that you want to answer here before I scroll through all these to do this.
Carol, can I jump in? Carol just
Please.
wrote something brilliant.
Please.
Okay. Carol just had a brilliant comment. Government needs to underwrite the cost of managing warehousing reclaimed material. It's cost prohibitive for a not-for-profit model, and nonprofits around Santa Barbara can't absorb, aren't able to manage structural. That is so important because we do tons of jobs that are in California and there's no storage space to be had. So if we can't get, that's such a great suggestion to have government subsidies to store, much like, you know, a Home Depot would be. But then again, me being the CPA, let's bring a financial component in it. What's in it for them? People could donate to government entities and still take the tax deduction. By the way, it can be a 501c3 or government. So people could potentially donate to those government standalone facilities if they were made. And then the government could even work on resale. So that just made my brain, you know, run in a lot of different directions, all good directions. So thank you.
Yeah. And hi, Carol, by the way. Hi. So let's see. Yeah, the who is it? San Antonio has incorporated something to that effect where they have started a collection place. I'd call it a warehouse space where they collect them and then they distribute those materials that are being diverted from their new deconstruction policy. And they are actually doing that on a free basis. So they collect them, store them, and then distribute them by people coming in to get them at that site. And that's part of their deconstruction policy. So that's kind of cool. But that's along the lines of what Carol was speaking to. So there is an example of it now. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. And Carol just wrote back, how do we make it a priority for cities to address this? From my perspective, we use the financial incentives. That's where it's got to be the mandates or it's got to be the incentives, where there's something in it for them, be it in a revenue or tax savings for the taxpayer, revenue for the city. That's the way that I see it, just in the nuts and bolts hard way that this always goes, is there's got to be a money factor to get the movement. I loved what Stephanie wrote in there about, I could just go on and on about the state of our society and my 5 children. And I hate it. We just all need to love each other. And if we built these communities and built relationships that were real and build upon those relationships, it would lend itself to sustainable living. So that's my 2 cents there.
Yeah. So Jory Wisniewski, thank you for clarifying on my point about it being more than a warehouse in San Antonio, that they've taken over a whole military base. I remember that now, and I'd forgotten that completely. And thank you for reminding me. But yeah, that's pretty awesome. Yeah, that's the right scale. Yeah, you have my back. Thank you very much. Yeah. So let's see. Stephanie had climate change is so important, but sometimes I feel like some people don't understand the human factor in all of that. How do we expect people to care about the environment when they hardly care about other people? Wow. That is that's a deep one. Understanding the opportunity to provide greater social equity through a circular economy and material reuse is so important. I've been seeing many projects come in way over budget during the tender opening of all because of supply chain issues. And the supply chain issues are due to environmental issues, the pandemic, wars, etc. Yeah, one of the things that we're working on, Stephanie, is the supply chain of the used materials. And thankfully, used materials actually have a different supply chain than new. You know, they don't come out of, we don't import used from from Canada, say, and then ship it over to China to do something to it, and then ship it back to do, to sell it here and distribute it by wholesale into the various distributorships and retail stores. We don't do that. That's the new model. But the used model, it's when the supply chains were falling apart just 2 years ago, and when there was the big freeze in Texas, and a lot of people don't know this, but the big freeze in Texas one winter just a couple of years ago stopped the production of resin in Houston, and Houston makes 90% of the resins that go into wood manufactured things like plywood and OSB and stuff like that. So that affected it. And then the Suez Canal thing, one ship turned sideways, slows down the whole world. I mean, things like that. But used materials, they're like, well, we still have them, and our supply chains aren't broken, and they're local, and they move quite much the same as they always do. So we have an advantage that we can leverage if we do more of what Jessica's talking about. Just build the darn thing, get this thing bigger and more robust. And I've been telling people for years, ever since I thought of the idea of recapture, I said, like, you know what, we're going to see used materials in an aisle of Home Depot and Lowe's and Menards and all those, because it's just inevitable. And Jory Winevsky, who is here today, represents Urban Machine, and Urban Machine is another thing that's highly worth talking about, which is robots pulling nails and bolts and screws and staples out of used lumber, cleaning it up, cleaning it on the surfaces, making it beautiful, clean and metal free, and spitting it out by the truckload per day. So that is another cool thing that's happening. There's so much going on, and thank you for putting the link in there, Jory. And there's so much cool stuff going on out there. I feel like we're getting close to a tipping point where things are going to start to snowball and get much better, and do things by virtue of they have to be done, because the codes are going to have to change if there's so much demand on code officials to change them by virtue of so much material being readily available and not subject to the same supply chain issues and priced right and all that good stuff. There's a push there. So keep doing what we're doing, and I'll stop for a minute. Let's go find another question before we have we're done. So I'm sorry, we're out of time, but thank you for the engagement in the chat. Like I said, I will save that and send that out to everybody, and in a message after this within the next few days, along with the link and a link to this. And I very much want here's the contact information for Leila Nattagh, Jessica Marschall, and myself. And I'll leave that on here for a minute. Wrapping it up here, our purpose with the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator is to help cities and counties create and implement well-crafted, effective policy for long-term solutions to a huge problem of construction and demolition waste. And we can't cover it all in one webinar, so we'll be following through with this with monthly webinars and boot camps and workshops. And so please engage with us. Spread the word, and share as much as you can with this marvelous community, because we're growing, but we're still a bunch of small organizations and small companies and individuals working very hard to bring this to a better state of affairs in the whole, to help the whole darn world. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Leila. You guys are so awesome. You're pioneers and you're experts, and I appreciate you being here, and see you all at the next webinar or the workshop or boot camp or at other webinars around the community. And remember, waste is not waste until it's wasted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for being here, everybody. See you next time. Bye. Okay. Hi, Carol.
Wait, where are you? Wait, let me get back to you.
Stop recording. There, now we're not recorded. Okay.
Wow, I was just copying an email address